312 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the same moment. The stars around them bent and shivered as they came through, and then the dark of space was full of metal, full of engines cooling down, full of long, gray hulls that caught the distant light of a yellow sun. High Executor Drav stood at the forward observation deck of his flagship and looked at that sun. It was smaller than he expected. Quieter, too, in the way stars could be quiet. No great coronal storms, no violent flares. Just a steady, old, yellow star, burning the way it had burned for billions of years. He found it underwhelming. The planet, though? The planet was a different matter. It sat in the habitable band, blue and white and brown, wrapped in thick cloud cover. From this distance, it looked almost peaceful. But Drav had read the old survey files on the journey here, and he knew better than to trust the look of it. The planet was not peaceful. The planet was, by every Vorkai classification standard, a nightmare. The deep probe scan from 2 centuries ago had cataloged what lived down there. Things with too many teeth. Things that moved in packs and communicated through sound vibrations. Things that used temperature extremes as a weapon against each other. The atmosphere was thick with a reactive gas that burned tissue on contact. The surface gravity was heavy enough to make most Vorkai uncomfortable after an hour. The weather systems produced electrical storms of enormous scale. The oceans were full of creatures that treated everything smaller than them as food. The Vorkai survey AI had flagged it as Deathworld Class 7. It had added a recommendation at the bottom of the report: defer colonization pending further study. That recommendation had been filed and forgotten for 200 years. But the Dominion was running out of options. The Empire had expanded fast, and fast expansion meant fast consumption. 12 of their colony worlds were now resource depleted. 4 more were close behind. The Dominion Council had looked at the maps, looked at the numbers, and decided that a death world was no longer something to avoid. They had terraforming technology now. They had biological suppression tools. Whatever lived on that planet, primitive or otherwise, could be removed or relocated. The planet itself was what mattered. The planet was rich. Drav had been given command of the colonization fleet because he was efficient. He had run 3 colonization campaigns before this one. He had never lost a world he went after. Sub-Commander Yin appeared at his side. Yin was younger than Drav, thin in the way that Vorkai officers from administrative academies tended to be, and he carried a data slate the way others carried weapons, always in his hands, always being read. Formation is stable, Yin said. All 312 warships confirmed. Colony carriers at the rear of the column. Administrative vessels midpoint. We are on schedule. Good, said Drav. Send Legate Sun ahead. Protocol requires a formal announcement before we begin surveys. Yin's expression shifted slightly. The inhabitants, if there are any, are pre-interstellar. Do we actually need to? Protocol, Drav said. Yin nodded and made a note. Legate Sun was a small, careful Vorkai who had delivered colonization proclamations to 4 worlds before this one. He did not enjoy it, but he was good at it. He took his diplomatic shuttle and began the long approach toward the inner system, toward the planet, carrying the standard Dominion Declaration in 14 languages. None of those 14 were the language of the planet he was approaching. That was expected. The languages of new worlds were always learned after acquisition. On the flagship, Orit, the fleet's appointed voice caster, responsible for recording the campaign for the Dominion archives, began setting up his equipment. He was a compact Vorkai with quick eyes and a habit of narrating things under his breath as he worked. He was already composing the opening lines of the colonization record in his head. Something about the fleet arriving like a tide. Something about the inevitable nature of expansion. He moved to the observation port and looked at the planet below. It was going to be a clean campaign. He could feel it. Then Yin looked up from his data slate. Commander, he said, the sensor array is showing something in the planet's orbital zone. Drav turned. What kind of something? At first read, I thought it was debris. Old satellites, maybe. Abandoned station components. Yin paused. He ran the scan again. But the distribution is not random. These are structures. Multiple structures. Occupied structures, based on thermal output. Drav was quiet for a moment. He was not alarmed. Primitive civilizations sometimes reached orbital capacity before they collapsed or plateaued. It was common enough. It changed nothing about the operation. How many structures? Yin's eyes moved across the data. Several dozen. Some are large. Another pause. Very large. Drav decided this was still not a problem. He would refile the planet's classification after they established ground control. Continue. Then the second alert came. One ship, destroyer class, moving from the direction of the third planet in the system, a cold, red, barely habitable rock on a direct intercept heading toward the fleet. One ship. The bridge crew saw it at the same moment. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Then somebody almost laughed. Drav did not. He studied the sensor reading without expression. One destroyer-class vessel, moving at full speed toward a fleet of 312 warships. Or it turned from the observation port and looked at the sensor display. He thought about it. Then he decided it was actually a good opening for his record. A kind of poetic gesture. The last, pointless defiance of a primitive world that did not understand what was coming. He began composing new lines. Then the single ship opened a communications channel and waited. The numbers on the targeting display did not lie. Nira Odom had been staring at them since the fleet dropped out of FTL, and the number had not changed. 312 warships, 40 colony carriers, dozens of support and administrative vessels behind those. The fleet filled the sensor grid from edge to edge like a city had decided to move through space. Odom did not look afraid. She looked the way she always looked when she was working, which was focused, still, and very quiet. She ran her calculations without being asked. She had targeting solutions on 11 lead formation vessels already. She updated the list, made a small note, and waited. Behind her, Engineer Sal Bright was on the ship's internal comm from the engine room, talking to nobody in particular. Engines are full. Thrusters are responsive. I've got a minor coolant bleed on port side, but it won't matter for at least 4 hours, and by then either we're done or it really won't matter. He paused. That was a joke. Mostly. Admiral Roe Callahan sat in the command chair and did not move. He was an old man by the standards of people who did dangerous things for a living, which meant he was not as old as he looked, but a great deal older than most people in the same line of work tended to get. He had a heavy face and gray eyes, and the kind of calm that came not from confidence, but from having already accepted every possible outcome of a situation before the situation began. Dr. Felix Crane sat at the communications station and prepared the translation package. He had been a xenolinguist for 11 years. He had never actually spoken to an alien species before. His hands were shaking slightly, but his voice, when he spoke, was steady. "Channel is open," he said. "They are receiving." Captain Dana Voss was standing near the front of the bridge. Not at the window. There was nothing useful in looking out the window at 300 ships when you had sensors that showed you the same thing in better detail. She was standing because it felt wrong to sit. She had her hands at her sides. Her uniform was pressed. She had pressed it herself, that morning, before any of this started, because she had known this day was coming and she had decided some time ago that she would meet it the right way. She spoke into the open channel. She gave the ship's name, registry number, and commanding authority. She identified the system as sovereign human territory under sole command jurisdiction. She informed the Armada, in clear and simple language, that they had entered human space without permission and were in violation of territorial law. She asked them to state their intentions. Then she stopped and waited. On the Vorkai flagship, Legate Sun was still en route in his shuttle. So it was Drav who received the communication first. He listened to the translation with an expression that was difficult to read. Then he said, quietly, "They have a territorial law?" Nobody on the bridge answered him. Yin listened to the message again. He noticed something about it. The language was precise. It was not a plea. It was not an alarm. It was a formal statement of position, with specific legal terminology delivered in a tone that did not suggest fear. He noted this and said nothing. Drav instructed his communications officer to connect to Legate Sun's shuttle and tell him to handle the response when he arrived. This was what Sun was for. Sun arrived at communication range 20 minutes later and delivered the standard Dominion colonization proclamation. He was polite. He was practiced. He offered terms for what the Dominion called voluntary relocation, a formal word for what happened to species that did not resist. He explained that the planet had been selected for integration into the Dominion and that the process would begin in a matter of days. He added, as he always did, that cooperation was in the best interest of the inhabitants. He was almost kind about it. Voss listened. When Sun finished, She spoke again. She asked the Armada to reverse course and vacate Sol space within 72 hours. She repeated this request a second time, then a third time. Each repetition was word for word identical to the first. There was a reason for this. Sol military protocol required 3 formal requests before any hostile action could be authorized. The 3 requests were not a stall. They were a legal process, and she was following it. Sun, on his shuttle, listened to the third request and then looked at the small viewport beside him. He could see the single human ship out there, far in the distance, still moving toward the fleet. Still moving, not stopping. He had done this 4 times on 4 worlds. Not once had a species sent one ship and then repeated themselves 3 times in that particular tone. He filed the observation away and decided it was probably nothing. On the Bastion, Callahan spoke for the first time since the channel opened. "Protocol satisfied," he said. "Weapons free on your judgment, Odom. Dana, you have the ship." Voss turned back toward the bridge. On the flagship, Drav watched the single human vessel adjust its course. It did not retreat. It moved to a parallel intercept heading, matching the pace of the Armada's advance column. He studied this for a moment. Then he told the fleet to continue forward and told Orit to keep recording. Orit was recording, but he was no longer composing poetic lines about tides and inevitability. He was watching the human ship on the sensor display, watching it hold its course without hesitation, and he was trying to understand why something so small, heading towards something so large, was not turning around. He had no answer for it, so he kept watching. On the Bastion, Odom updated her firing tables. Her solutions were better now than they had been an hour ago. She had been improving them the whole time. She would keep improving them. The Armada advanced. The Bastion moved with it, steady, quiet, weapons hot. Orit had a system. Every campaign began the same way. He opened the original survey file on the target world, found the 3 most striking facts about the planet and its inhabitants, and used those facts as the frame of his record. It gave the archive a sense of shape. It made the story easy to follow for whoever read it 100 years from now. Here is what the world was. Here is what the Dominion found. Here is what happened next. He opened the Earth file. The first striking fact was the biology. The planet was full of dangerous things, and not in the way that some worlds were dangerous, not volcanic, not irradiated, not atmospherically hostile to Vorkai lungs. It was biologically dangerous. The creatures that had evolved there had done so in competition with each other across millions of years, and the result was an ecosystem where almost everything had developed some method of killing. Claws, venom, speed, camouflage. The top-level predators on the surface were large, fast, and territorial. The ocean predators were larger. Some of the insects were venomous enough to kill a Vorkai in under an hour. Orit noted this and moved on. The second striking fact was the weather. The planet's atmosphere was active in ways that the Dominion's survey AI had found difficult to model. Enormous pressure systems formed and collapsed across ocean surfaces. In the northern and southern latitudes, temperatures dropped far enough to freeze liquids solid for months at a time. In the equatorial zones, heat and moisture combined to create storm systems that could sustain themselves for days. The planet's own magnetic field redirected charged particles from the sun in patterns that generated visible light at the poles. Even the sky was violent. Orit noted this and moved on. The third striking fact was harder to categorize. The original survey had included a brief notation on the dominant species. It was mammalian. It was bipedal. It had spread across the planet's surface and built structures and used tools. The notation was short because the probe had not been designed for biological deep study. It was a resource and terrain survey, not a civilization assessment. The entry on the dominant species was 3 paragraphs, and one of those paragraphs was mostly about the species' apparent lack of interstellar capability. Orit read the 3 paragraphs. Then he looked at the sensor data that had been coming in since the fleet arrived. Then he read the 3 paragraphs again. The structures in orbit. The probe had called them absent. But the structures in orbit were not absent. There were dozens of them. Some were small communications relays, Orit assumed, or navigational markers. But some were not small. Some of the structures in orbit were large enough to house populations. Not large by Dominion standards, but large. Occupied. Maintained. Not ancient. He ran an electromagnetic scan of the planet's surface. What came back was dense. radio signals, tight beam transmissions, encrypted data channels. The planet was talking to itself constantly, in 100 different frequencies, and some of those signals were also going outward to the orbital structures, to the red planet further out in the system, and to points beyond that Orit could not immediately identify. He sat with this for a moment. The survey file said, primitive civilization, pre-interstellar. The sensor data said, a civilization that had reached into its own solar system and built things there. These were not the same statement. He began a population estimate. The calculation was rough. It was based on thermal output, electromagnetic density, and structural footprint. But the number it returned was not the number he had expected. He ran it again. The number was the same. He set it aside and told himself it was a model error. Yin had been running his own analysis across the bridge, and he had come to a different set of conclusions by a different route. He had gone back to the original survey AI's full report, not the summary that appeared in the mission file, but the raw document. It was long. Most of it was terrain and atmospheric data. But at the very end, after the standard classification fields, there was a supplemental notation. The survey AI had added it automatically, triggered by something it observed in the surface scan. The notation read, evidence of organized, large-scale interspecies conflict observed across multiple surface regions. Inhabitants demonstrate capacity for coordinated violence at industrial scale. Recommend classification review and defer colonization pending further behavioral study. Below it was a response field, marked, filed. No action taken. Yin stared at this for a long time. Then something happened on the sensor display that made him look up. The human ship had deployed objects. Small ones, dozens of them, scattered in a dispersed pattern directly in the path of the fleet's lead column. They were small enough that the fleet's automated proximity systems had not flagged them as threats. They moved slowly. They sent no aggressive signals. But they were moving through the fleet. Between ships, under hulls, around sensor arrays. Drav noticed them 2 minutes after they appeared. He ordered the fleet to sweep and destroy them. The Vorkai point defense grids went to work. The small objects died quickly, one by one. But they had not been built to survive. They had been built to look. On the bastion, Sal Bright watched the last of the drones go dark on his board. All gone, he said. He was not sad about it. But we got everything? Everything, said Odom. The data package that came back from the drones was transmitted to Sol High Command before the last drone was destroyed. Every ship in the Vorkai fleet was now cataloged. Every hull configuration, every shield frequency, every weapon port, and its firing arc. Odom updated her targeting tables again. They were very good now. Yin told Drav about the drones and what they had done. Drav listened and said that the primitives had made a futile gesture. Yin said that it was not a gesture. A gesture did not require precision engineering and coordinated deployment at fleet range. Drav did not answer him. Yin returned to his data slate. He looked at the notation from the survey AI. He looked at the orbital structures on the sensor display. He looked at the human ship, still holding its parallel course. He had a feeling. He was not sure what to do with it yet. On the bastion, Callahan told Crane to prepare a targeting advisory for command. Crane asked if he should also prepare a second formal request for the Armada to withdraw. Callahan thought about it. No, he said. We already gave them 3. The shot came from nowhere. That was how it felt on the Vorkai flagship, because the sensors had been tracking the human vessel for hours and nobody had expected it to actually fire. It was one ship. It had been one ship the entire time, and the assumption that ran so deep it was almost invisible was that one ship would not fire on 300. But one ship did. The first round was not aimed at a warship. It was aimed at a Vorkai Formation Coordinator, a medium-class vessel, whose primary function was managing the advance column's movement and spacing. Not heavily armed, not heavily shielded, not the kind of ship anyone would bother targeting in a conventional engagement because it posed no direct threat. The shot hit it exactly where the drone data had shown the coordinator's relay core to be. The ship went dark on communications. Its column subgroup immediately lost formation cohesion and began drifting without coordination signals. Before the fleet could process this, the Bastion fired twice more. Same kind of target each time. Same precision. 2 more formation coordinators went quiet. 3 adjacent subgroups of the advance column lost their synchronization and began moving independently. The Armada's lead advance, which had been moving as a single organized body, was now three separate pieces moving in slightly different directions. It was not devastating. It was not supposed to be. It was a demonstration. Drav processed this in about 4 seconds and understood what had happened. The drone sweep had mapped his ships. The human vessel had used that map to identify exactly which ships to hit to cause the maximum disruption with the minimum number of rounds. It had not tried to destroy anything. It had tried to break the formation's ability to function together. He ordered a return volley. Full forward battery across all lead group vessels. 87 weapons platforms locked onto the Bastion's last position and fired. What followed was something the Vorkai crew watched with a confusion that slowly curdled into something colder. The human ship moved. Not fast by Vorkai fighter standards, it was a destroyer, not an interceptor. But it moved in a way that did not follow predictable lines. It moved in short, hard burns, with pauses between them, and the pauses came in patterns that seemed random until they weren't. The volley hit empty space. Twice. A third salvo caught the rear of the vessel and struck it 2 clean hits. Sensor array gone, 1 hull section breached. The ship kept moving. Sal Bright had been planning those evasion burns for 6 hours. He had done it quietly, in the engine room, using the fleet's own formation data to model where the fire would come from and at what angles. The calculations lived in his head and in a handwritten set of notes he kept in a pocket. He had not shared them with anyone because there was no time to explain them, and because the maneuvers needed to be instinctive, not deliberate, once the shooting started. He had preloaded the burn sequences into the engine control board himself. When the 2 hits came, he felt them through the floor. A deep, hard shudder. Then a sound he did not like. Then the pressure warning. Hull breach, Section 4, his board told him. Corporal Yusuf Adara was already moving before the announcement finished. He had been suited up in EVA gear for 3 hours, waiting in the Section 4 corridor with 2 crew members, because Bright had told him an hour ago, with great specificity, that Section 4 was most likely to take a hit. Adara had not questioned this. He had suited up and waited. The breach was bad. Not catastrophic, but bad. Atmosphere venting. Metal bent inward. Adara moved through the damaged section while the ship was still maneuvering, which meant the gravity compensators were fighting the burn corrections, which meant walking was more like controlled falling. He found the breach point, assessed it, and told his crew what to do. They had trained for this. They did not panic. They sealed the breach from the inside with emergency patch material and then welded it from the outside, taking turns at the hull while the other held the line. The repair took 11 minutes. The ship did not stop fighting while they worked. Drav launched interceptors. 80 of them, Vorkai fighter class, fast and armed for close engagement. They came in a wide sweep pattern designed to saturate any point defense system. Odom fired the Bastion's point defense grid in a mode that Vorkai fire pattern modeling did not anticipate, because the mode prioritized coverage density over accuracy and compensated by firing at slightly earlier intercept points than standard. The math was hers. She had worked it out in the quiet hours before the engagement and loaded it manually. 31 interceptors were destroyed before they closed to effective range. The remaining 49 regrouped for a second pass. They swept wide, building speed for an attack run. The Bastion did not run. It moved deliberately, precisely into a position that put it between the incoming interceptors and one of the Vorkai colony carriers. A large, heavy vessel near the middle of the fleet, full of equipment and, by the manifest that the drone data had partially captured, automated terraforming systems. The interceptors could not attack without risking the colony carrier behind the human ship. They broke off. Drav watched this. He did not speak for almost a full minute. Then he turned to Yin. Yin was already watching him. Yin had been waiting for this moment. Withdraw the interceptors, Yin said. We need to stop and reassess. No, Drav said. Commander, this vessel has demonstrated tactical adaptability that our engagement models do not cover. The drone deployment was intelligence gathering. The targeting was exact. The evasion maneuvers were pre-calculated. This is not a desperate defense. This is... I know what it looks like, Drav said. Then we should. Send the full lead battle group forward, Drav said. All of it. Destroy that ship. Yin was quiet. He did not argue further. He made a note in his data slate. Or it had stopped recording 7 minutes into the engagement. His equipment was still on. He simply was not adding narration anymore. He stood at the observation port and watched the sensor display instead. The lead battle group, 60 warships, began to move. On the Bastion, Crane looked up from his console. A message had arrived from Seoul High Command. He read it once. Then again. "Admiral," he said. "Authorization package. Priority 1. Callahan reached into the front pocket of his uniform and took out a flat key card that he had carried there, next to his chest, for the entire mission. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the display showing 60 warships moving toward his ship. "Open the package," he said. The authorization code was not complicated. It was a 12-digit sequence, and Callahan entered it into the command interface the same way he might enter any other administrative command. No ceremony, no pause, no speech. He typed it in. He pressed confirm. He put the key card back in his pocket. For a moment, nothing happened. The sensors showed 60 Vorkai warships advancing. The Bastion held its position. Odom had her firing solutions ready. Bright had 3 more evasion sequences preloaded. Adara was back in the corridor, resuited, because he had decided it was better to be ready again than to assume the first breach was the only one. Crane sat at his console and waited. Voss stood near the front of the bridge and did not move. Then the sensors changed. It was subtle at first. New contacts appearing at the edges of the display. Small ones. Far ones. Contacts in places where there should have been nothing, deep in the asteroid belt, in the dark belt between Mars and Jupiter. Contacts buried in the shadow of moons. Contacts in the L4 and L5 orbital points around the planet, where debris sometimes accumulated and sensors sometimes ignored things that looked like debris. The contacts grew warm. Their power signatures shifted from cold, dark, inactive to active in a sequence, not all at once, but in a spreading pattern, like something waking up across a very large space. They were weapons platforms. Not ships. Platforms. Fixed installations, built into rock and shadow and darkness, designed to be invisible to sensors that were not specifically looking for them. They had no engines, no crews, no communication signatures when they were dark. They were cold metal and composite shell, indistinguishable from the natural material around them. They had been placed there over 30 years, one at a time, in classified operations that never appeared in any public record of Seoul's defense spending. Nobody outside of Seoul High Command and a handful of flag officers knew exactly how many there were. The Vorkai fleet found out now. Every ship in the Armada, all 312 warships, all 40 colony carriers, all of the support and administrative vessels was suddenly bracketed by targeting signals from multiple directions simultaneously. Not from the Bastion, from the platforms, from the asteroid belt and the lunar shadow and the dark orbital points where nothing was supposed to be. The sensors on the Vorkai flagship lit up in a way that the crew had never seen. Every target indicator, every proximity alert, every weapons lock warning in the system activated at once. The display became a wall of signals. The flagship's defense computer tried to prioritize threats and could not, because there was no priority. The threats were everywhere, in every direction, distributed across the entire volume of space the fleet occupied. Drav stood at his command post and looked at his display and did not speak. The lead battle group had stopped advancing. The 60 warships had not received an order to stop. They had stopped because their own commanders, looking at their own displays, had made independent decisions that continuing forward was not wise. Dr. Crane had been working for 12 minutes on the translation package while all of this was happening. He had taken the broadcast text, which had been written before the mission and updated twice during the journey, and checked it against 14 known Vorkai dialect files. He had tested the pronunciation markers, adjusted 3 idioms that did not translate well from human legal language to Vorkai formal register, and confirmed the audio encoding. He told Voss it was ready. Voss broadcast it on all open frequencies. Every ship in the fleet received it simultaneously. The message began by stating facts. It identified the Vorkai fleet by designation. It cited the specific moment the fleet had crossed into Seoul sovereign space. It cited the 3 formal requests to withdraw that had been issued before hostilities. It cited the discharge of weapons against a Seoul command vessel, which under Seoul military law constituted an act of war. These were not accusations. They were a record. Then it stated the offer. Every ship currently targeted by Sol defense infrastructure would be released from targeting lock upon confirmed reversal of course. The Vorkai fleet could leave. No pursuit would be authorized. No further action would be taken if the Armada withdrew now and did not return. Sol Command was not interested in a war. It was interested in the security of its territory. Then it stated the condition. The offer was valid for 10 minutes from the time of broadcast. After 10 minutes, if the Armada had not begun withdrawal, Sol Command would treat the situation as a sustained act of war and respond accordingly. Then it ended. No threat, no bluster, no description of what respond accordingly meant. The message did not need to explain it. Every ship in the fleet was looking at exactly what it meant on their sensor displays right now. The 10 minutes began. On the bastion, nobody moved. Callahan stayed in his chair. Voss stayed at the front of the bridge. Odom kept her hands near the firing console. Bright watched his engine board. Crane watched the comm channel for any incoming signal. Adara, in the corridor, did not know what was happening on the bridge, but he knew the ship had gone very quiet, and he stayed still and waited with it. The first 2 minutes passed without any signal from the fleet. On the flagship, Yin stood next to Drav and watched the display. He did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. He had already said the useful things. Drav was very still, which was unusual. Drav was not a still person. He was a person who moved and directed and made decisions. The stillness meant the decisions had stopped arriving. Sun, still on his diplomatic shuttle, requested guidance from the flagship. He had been watching his own display, and he was frightened in the contained, careful way that experienced diplomats got frightened. He had not changed his expression, but he had begun composing his personal incident report in his head, and the first line was already bleak. The 4th minute passed. The 5th, or it was not recording. He was standing very still at the observation port, looking out at the dark of space, and he was thinking about the single human ship that had been out there the whole time. One ship, not a decoy, he understood now, not a desperate last gesture. A key, something that had to be present and had to fire first so that a larger mechanism could activate. A trigger in a system that was already loaded and waiting. He thought about what that meant. He thought about how long a civilization had to be afraid, how long, and how seriously it had to take a threat to build something like this, and hide it, and wait. And then he thought about the fact that the humans had not built this because they were afraid. You did not build this if you were afraid. You built this if you were patient. There was a difference. He had not understood that difference until now. The 8th minute passed. At 9 minutes and 43 seconds, the Vorkai Armada began to turn. Not all at once. The flagship moved first, and the fleet followed in cascade, the way large organized things moved when the thing at the center finally changed direction. The 60 warships of the lead battle group turned first, then the main column, then the colony carriers at the rear, large and slow, taking longer than the rest. The Sol defense platforms tracked them the entire way. The targeting locks did not release until the last ship had confirmed an outbound heading. On the bastion, Callahan watched the display until the last Vorkai ship had turned. Then he sat back in his chair and let out a breath through his nose. Voss turned away from the front of the bridge and walked to the center console and looked at the display. The fleet was leaving. The numbers were the same: 312 warships, 40 colony carriers, all the rest, but they were moving in the other direction now, and they were picking up speed. She said nothing. There was nothing to say that the display was not already saying better. Sal Bright sat down on the floor of the engine room when the alert level dropped. Not in a chair. On the floor, with his back against the base of the main power conduit, which was warm against his spine because it had been running hot for hours. He sat there with his handwritten notes in his lap and looked at the ceiling for a while. The notes had 6 pages of burn calculations and timing sequences, all of which were now useless, and he was extremely glad they were useless. He stayed on the floor for about 10 minutes. Then he got up and started checking the coolant bleed he had mentioned before everything started. There was work to do. There was always work to do. Bright preferred it that way. In the Section 4 corridor, Corporal Yusuf Adara peeled off his EVA suit one piece at a time. He did it carefully, the way he always did, because suit components that were thrown around or dropped hard wore out faster, and you never knew when you would need them again in a hurry. He set each piece in its rack. He checked each seal. He stored the helmet last. Then he sat on the bench in the corridor, in his undershirt, and looked at the patched breach in the wall beside him. The patch was ugly. It would need proper repair at dock. But it was holding, and the corridor was pressurized, and the ship was still moving. He had done his job. He found that this was enough. Nira Odom powered down the weapons console in stages. She did it the way she did everything at the console, which was deliberately running through each shutdown sequence in the correct order without skipping steps. When the last targeting system went dark, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the console surface. She had not fired everything she had. She had not needed to. She was not relieved about this, or rather, she was, but in a very deep and quiet way that she did not intend to examine right now. She filed her engagement report, locked the console, and stood up. Dr. Felix Crane confirmed the termination of all broadcast channels and archived the full communication log from the engagement. He labeled the files, time-stamped them, and routed them to Sol Command's secure record system. Then he sat back and looked at his console. He had spoken to an alien civilization today. He had done it in 14 of their dialects. The conversation had been brief and not particularly warm, but it had been clear. They had understood. He had made sure of it. He considered this a professional success and decided he would think more carefully about what it meant as a human experience sometime later, when he was not on a damaged ship holding a parallel course next to empty space, where 300 warships had been an hour ago. Voss wrote her after-action report in 4 sentences. The Vorkai colonization fleet entered Sol space without authorization. The Bastion intercepted and engaged. Sol defense infrastructure was activated under standing authorization. The fleet withdrew. She sent it to Callahan and then began the longer work of compiling crew performance assessments, system damage reports, and resource expenditure records. These were less interesting than the 4-sentence version, but more useful, and she did not have a strong preference for interesting over useful. Callahan sent a single-word reply to Sol High Command. Done. He had considered several longer options and rejected them all. The word covered the situation accurately. Then he told Voss to set course for Luna Station and sat back in his chair and watched the stars through the forward port for a while. They were ordinary stars. They looked exactly the same as they had looked before any of this happened. He found this reassuring. On the Vorkai flagship, heading away from the solar system at full speed, Drav said nothing for a long time. The bridge crew did not speak to him. They attended to their duties. The ship moved. The fleet moved with it. When Drav finally spoke, it was to his logistics officer to request a damage and casualty assessment. 31 interceptors lost. 3 coordination vessels disabled, crew evacuated. No warships destroyed. The numbers were not catastrophic by fleet engagement standards. They felt catastrophic. He was going to face a tribunal. He knew this the way he knew the course heading as simple, operational fact. The loss of face. The retreat. The 300 warships turned around by 1 vessel and a system of hidden platforms that his intelligence apparatus had not known existed. The Council would want explanations. He did not have explanations that would satisfy them. He had made decisions that seemed rational at each step and had assembled, by the end, into a serious failure. He was going to have to explain that. He would try. Yen sat at his station and worked on his report. It was not going to be a short report. He had already written 40 pages, and he was not close to done. He had a great deal to say about categorical assumptions in military intelligence, about the relationship between survey data age and operational reliability, about the danger of treating absence of information as equivalent to absence of capability. He had things to say about the human vessel specifically, about the way it had fought, about the decision to send it alone as both a tactical trigger and a symbolic statement. He wrote carefully. He wanted this to be read. Not by the tribunal would read what they read. He wanted it to be read by every officer in the Dominion who might one day look at a survey file on an unknown world and assume that what the file said was the whole truth. He titled it, On the Error of Categorical Dismissal, the Human Engagement and its Implications for Dominion Threat Assessment. The last section was a recommendation that the Vorkai Dominion reclassify Earth in all official records. The current designation was Deathworld Class 7, unclaimed. Yen proposed a new designation. He called it Sovereign Deathworld Do Not Approach without formal diplomatic contact. He noted that the category did not previously exist in Dominion classification systems, and that he was proposing it be created specifically for this world and any others that demonstrated comparable characteristics. He thought about that for a moment. Then he added, and it is recommended that the search for other such worlds be treated as a high-priority intelligence matter. Or it did eventually manage to delete most of his recordings. The narration was gone. The triumphant framing he had planned was gone. The opening lines about tides and inevitability gone. He was thorough about it. He was not thorough enough. The recordings he missed were the ones he had taken in the early hours, before the engagement, when he had simply been pointing his equipment at the sensor display out of habit. They were not dramatic recordings. They showed a display. They showed the data returns from one human vessel, alone in front of a fleet, moving at steady speed toward the formation, not stopping, not slowing. He had not deleted those because he had not thought of them as the story. He had been saving them for background context. He had thought the story would come later. It turned out those were the story. A Dominion archivist recovered them during the review process 18 months after the engagement. They were added to the official record of the incident. Yin's report was added to the file alongside them and marked, by order of the review committee, as required reading for all senior fleet officers. The file was sealed at the classification level used for events the Dominion considered formative. Not shameful. Formative. There was a difference, though it was a small one in practice. The final line of Yin's report read, simply, they sent one ship. Not because one ship was enough. Because they wanted us to understand what the one ship meant. It meant there were more. The Bastion reached Luna Station 4 days later. It came in slow because the maneuvering thrusters were uneven from the hull damage. A repair crew met it at the docking arm. The crew walked off, one at a time, into the ordinary sounds and lights of a station going about its day. Nobody made a speech. Nobody was waiting with a ceremony. There was a debrief scheduled and paperwork, and Bright had already transmitted a detailed repair list to the station's engineering bay that they were going to have strong feelings about. It was very normal. That was exactly how Callahan had wanted it.